to your next set of lectures with me. I'm Amanda Bamford. I'm a Professor of Plant Sciences in the Faculty of Biology, Medicine and Health, and I'm also the University Academic Lead for Sustainability. And I have researched in the past on climate change and also on air pollution, NOx and ozone air pollution. So it's a very timely topic. There's lots and lots in the news about air pollution at the moment and impacts on human health, and the UK being taken to the European Court to be prosecuted for air pollution levels. Do you remember that a year or so ago? But my interest, particularly around air pollution, is more about impacts on crops, plants, agriculture, vegetation. You hear a lot about air pollution and impacts on health from the roads, around Oxford Road and alerts, but much less about its impacts on our ecosystems. So that's going to be my main topic. I'm not going to talk about effects on health. I've got one slide on that, but I really want to, part of this, my aim is to alert you to its other impacts. So we all know that air pollution is a key environmental and social issue. We've only got to read the news lately about cars by schools and how schools are trying to reduce the impact of air pollution from cars on their children playing in the playground. But it's multidisciplinary problem. There's people in seas working on atmospheric chemistry of air pollutants. There's lawyers involved. There's lots of people involved. It's a very complex problem involving multiple challenges. And it's not only, just make a little bit of, highlight something here, that it actually is produced by natural sources as well. Anyone can name me a natural source of air pollutants? Sorry? The soil, yes, coming up from from agriculture, tilling the soil. Anything else?
A volcano.
Volcanoes is the classic one, yeah, and natural fires as well. And so it's not just anthropogenic; it's not all man-made. So we can divide air pollutants in two main groups: primary pollutants and also secondary pollutants. And in these lectures, I'm going to concentrate, the next two lectures after this one's like an intro roundup one. Next two lectures, I'm going to talk about NOx pollution, nitrogen-containing pollutants, which are primary pollutants. They're produced directly. And then also a pollutant called ozone, which is a secondary pollutant. And this is produced by reactions amongst primary pollutants under certain conditions like high light. So that's a secondary pollutant. So air pollution can have effects on health, ecosystems, built environment, our urban environment, and also the climate. So over these 4 lectures, these are my aims to show you right at the beginning. This first one, we're going to talk about air quality and pollutants from transport to get you into the picture of what we're talking about. And as I said, the next lecture we're going to talk about nitrogen pollution, how much is being inputted into the environment and what impacts it can have or is having, all this extra nitrogen being watered into our environment. And then we're going to talk about ozone, which is a very phytotoxic pollutant, and how it's going to affecting our crops. And then finally, on the last one, there's a lot to say about ozone, so I'm probably going to overrun that lecture, and some of it's going to go into the last one. And also, we're going to have a seminar. We're going to have a discussion groups in this last one, and I'm going to talk about that, tell you what you need to prepare. So for that last one, which is in a week today, there's some reading. Have you seen this on Blackboard? If you go onto my folder under the course unit on Blackboard, it gives you the reading you need to do for the Thursday next week on this last session. It's really important you do that, otherwise you'll be sitting there not knowing what on earth we're talking about. There's a couple of papers to read, and there's also some questions to answer, like to help you highlight with you the important parts of those 2 papers I've asked you to read. So I want you to get engaged in the topic now. So this is what I was talking about. For lecture 9, I'm going to finish off the topic and you're going to read these 2 papers. I've put links onto Blackboard for you, so you don't even have to go and find them. And download the question sheet and answer the questions reading those 2 papers. And then we're going to come back as a group and go through them and see what they're telling us, these 2 research papers. Okay, and for the master students, you'll be doing more and more of this after week 6. You'll be doing more, looking at lots of papers. So this is introducing you to this idea. And for the undergraduates, this is the sort of thing you do in the final year. You'll need to be looking at more and more papers. This is introducing the idea of reading around the topic. It's so important in your final year and for your masters. I can't tell you all there is to know about air pollution in 4 lectures. I could talk about ozone in 6, just ozone in 6 lectures and still won't cover it. So it's really important that you read around the topic. And on Blackboard, I've given you lots of extra reading to read, suggestions for you to read, but obviously there's even more than that. So there might be a bit that I'm talking about that you find particularly interesting, that particular area. Go and have a read a bit more about it. All I'm doing here is saying, hey, look, there's work in this area. Hey, look, there's somebody looking at this. And then it's up to you to go and dig deeper. Okay? So why should we worry about it? Yeah? I'm sure we all know about health problems, but the problems with air pollution, unlike other pollutants, very often which are released into the environment and have an immediate effect, a lot of air pollutants are cumulative. They're hidden. You don't see them. You walk in Oxford Road, you don't realise all the PM10s and the particles and the NOx that you're breathing in. It's an unseen pollutant and it's a cumulative impacts very often. So it's a much more, very often it's a much more gradual impact. And especially when you're talking about ecosystems and plants which are living out in the environment for long periods of time, that it might take a few years before you actually, especially like, you can imagine trees spending their whole lifetime in an air polluted environment. And it might take a while before you see the impacts at all. And I don't need to tell you, again, I'm not going to show, you can read all these slides at your leisure, but you can see here the number of cars and transport on our roads is just going up and up and up. Yeah? So there's a long-term trend. I've got some figures here. 327 billion miles were driven on Great Britain's roads in 2017. All that mileage is producing pollutants, and it's going up. And this is my only slide on the human impacts of air pollution. Yeah, I'll mention it a little bit later in a table, but basically there's more and more information coming out now and linking the number of deaths to air pollutants. In the past, we've had people knew that air pollution can cause deaths from smogs in London. I'm sure you've all read about that. In the 1950s, I don't know whether you noticed from my accent, I'm from London, and my father used to live in the East End of London, and he used to tell me about going to school in early 50s, and 1952 especially, if you look it up, 1952, there was lots and lots of deaths that winter from air pollutants, because there was so much smog in the air you couldn't walk through the street without a torch. You couldn't see your hand in front of you. Now, lucky enough, those days have gone, but it doesn't mean the impact of air pollutants is gone, and there's now more and more evidence that there's deaths can be deliberately linked to transport pollution. Although it's just not so obvious. We don't have the really big smogs. Well, not in this country. Obviously, there's other big cities in the world that are still suffering from considerable smogs. One of the main pollutants from road transport is PM10s. Does anybody know what PM stands for? Anybody could tell me? Particulate matter. Yeah, so these are little soot particles. Used to put black carbon, another name for it. And for a long time, I'm going to mainly talk about UK monitoring. If you're from a different country, go and have a look and see if you can find the monitoring information from your country. Okay? But in this country, we've been monitoring PM10s. What's the 10 stand for? Anybody? Size of it, yeah, 10 micrometers. So we've been measuring PM10s for a long time, and in the last few years they've started measuring PM2.5, which is a much smaller particle, because there's worry now saying, well, actually, it's the much smaller particles that we should be worried about, because they're the ones you can breathe right into your alveoli of your lung. So now there's more monitoring also being done on PM2.5. So you'll see those two things. I'm not going to talk much about particulates, because that's another set of lectures. Okay, but I just wanted to highlight that they're a big issue at the moment. And these are two maps. This one here on the left is the particulate matter concentrations in urban roads. And the one on the right is the background. And if you look at all the monitoring across the UK, it's not hard to see that a lot of the source from PM10s is from the motorways and the road distribution. Okay. And this is the emissions of PM10s since 1992, and the sources of them. And you can see road transport, agricultural waste, other transports, all in there, all the different sources. And you can see the amount of PM10s has dropped considerably since 1992. Yeah? We've got cleaner cars, we've got more awareness about PM10s. But I'm going to come back to this again and again with some of our other pollutants. The worry is now that we're levelling off. A lot of the reduction in emissions we're not seeing. And they're now looking at what more should we be doing. And this is where the government's getting a lot of push to say we need to do some more drastic action, because our big increases, we're levelling off, we're not seeing the reductions that we should do going forward. So air pollutants from transport, along the top of this table is all the different pollutants, main gaseous pollutants. You can see lead there still. And this is the sources along the left-hand side. So all I want you to look at for this purpose of these lectures is transport sources. And the ones highlighted in green are where transport sources are the main source. So you see, 42% of the CO2 in England is from road transport. Nitrogen dioxide, or oxides here, 45%. And then PM10s, which we're just looking at, 26%. So you can see transport is a really, really major source of a lot of these air pollutants. That's why I'm concentrating on those sources. I mean, there is another one, you'll be talking about input from agriculture later, or have you had those lectures from John? Yeah, so he's talking about agriculture. Obviously, agriculture as well is on here. There we go, agriculture. But in terms of some of these other, so that's a main source for ammonia. But I'm talking about the impacts from transport. In the UK, we have a lot of legislation and compulsory reporting of our air pollutant monitoring. So for this lecture, I'm really going to go through quite quickly about the sources of information that are out there that you can tap into. You can go in, and I'll show you the links. I'll put them all on my website, so you can go at your leisure and play around and find out what the air pollutant is along your road if you're living in the UK at the moment. And at the moment, the UK has to report air quality data annually and show how we are performing against air pollution European directives. Don't ask me what's going to happen if we exit without a deal. I don't know what's going to happen to these sort of things. So these are the directives that we have to fall under and follow. And every year there's a report that comes out that goes to the EU. I've put this on Blackboard, and there's also a link here to go and have a look at it. Although it's 2017, this is the latest report. It's always delayed by the time they analyse all the data, unfortunately. I absolutely update all my lectures every year. So all the graphs you're seeing now are the most recent ones available. Okay? So there's a number of pollutants we have to report under the EU directive. And because we have to report them, there's a lot of monitoring data. We're monitoring them all over the UK. And I don't know whether you've ever walked down Piccadilly just up before Oxford, outside MMU, up there. There's a big green box with some things on top of it. That's one of the monitoring stations that are used for air pollution. and there's another one in Piccadilly. And you can go on to the DEFRA website and you can actually see where all these monitoring stations are. So we're monitoring constantly these pollutants here that you see linked here. And you can see some of them, there's ozone and nitrogen dioxides are the top two that I'm going to be talking about. And then the UK then has to compile an inventory talking about our emissions and what our concentrations are. And there's a set of objectives and EU limits and targets that we have to either try and hit, although we're not doing particularly well. And if you go to this link here, it will give you all the objectives that we should be meeting. So you could go and look at what our actual emissions are and then look at our objectives and see how well we're doing. And for a lot of these pollutants, we're not doing particularly well. So for the purpose of air quality monitoring across the UK, what they've done is they've divided the UK into 43 zones, and they report on these 43 zones. Okay. So the easiest thing, what you do in these reports, you go and have a look and see what your zone's like of where you live. So again, this is the latest data, 2017. 37 of those 43 zones exceeded the annual mean limit for NOx. In other words, high levels of NOx. We're not meeting our objectives for health. All right, I'm talking about health now at the moment because that's what we report on at the moment. And it's not got any better. It was the same in 2015 and 2016. That straight away tells you that for large parts of the UK, we're not doing very well at all in terms of our NOx pollution. Right? 34 zones exceeded the long-term objective for ozone. And I'm going to come back to these because air pollution has these weird units and you have to always quote the unit. And so things to look out for, and by the end of these lectures you'll get the feel of them. This is annual mean limit value. So it's the annual concentration. So think about that for a minute, how relevant that is in terms of what happens from month to month or hour to hour, right? But this is annual mean. And this one is 8-hour maximum daily mean. So that's the maximum peak that was met over 8 hours. Okay? That's the unit. All zones according to one metric, all right? All zones met long-term objectives set for vegetation. I'm quoting this from the report, by the way. That's why it's worded this way. All zones meet long-term objectives set for vegetation. I'm going to talk about this unit later and explain what that is. And in 2016, the year before, 5 didn't meet it. I'm going to come back to this, and you might want to think about whether you really believe what they're trying to say here. In other words, there's no effect on vegetation. Hopefully by the end of my lectures you might realise that that's not true, because it all depends on how you measure it. Yeah? Again, if you want to go and have a look at air quality and limits, go to this document and you can look at it your heart's content. All I'm doing is, at the moment, I'm just picking out bits for you. So what happens is, you think, all right then, so say an area has failed. It's not met its legal objectives. What then happens? Well, what has to happen? That area has to declare an air quality management area. They're basically saying, we've not met our targets, we're going to have to declare an air quality management area. And then they have to put a plan in place to say what they're going to do about it. All right? And again, we have to report on this. And at 2017, 278 local authorities declared an AQMA. Right? So 71% of the local authorities in the UK have declared AQMA. Think about that for a second. That's a huge number of people putting their hands up saying we're not meeting our targets. And it's known that most of them have failed because there's all those air pollutants they're monitoring. If you look carefully at what they're failing on, it's PM10s and NOx. In other words, their transport. Yeah, they're failing to control their air pollution from transport. You can have hours of fun with a lot of these links I've got going here. This is the AQMA interactive map. So you can go on and look, all these blue are the ones that have got declared an AQMA. In other words, they are not coping with their pollutant. So let's do... That's Manchester. So there's a big AQMA in Manchester. Yeah, but you could type in your own postcode and find out whether you are living in with an AQMA. All right, and then you can actually go and have a look at the data and see what pollutant is failing at and what the levels are. So, in terms of information, we're at a wash with it in the UK. Okay, but the only thing is, it's all in different places, so that's why I've given you lots of links to go and find it. But it's amazing what you can find. So, as I said, most of the areas are failing to reach their targets, and here you can see NOx. 96 of the AQMAs have failed because of their NOx levels, and 75% because of their PM10s. Yeah, so those are the main reasons. And, you know, if you think, if I look at my area, I live near Warrington, and I've got the M62 going across that way, I've got M56 there, I've got M6 going up that way. Yeah? What is Warrington Borough Council going to be able to do with that other than shutting the motorways? They themselves have very little that they can do. Yeah? There are some things, but because of where they are with all the motorways, so I think they're always going to fail. They're always going to be AQMA unless they shut the M6 that runs right past the town. Yeah? Unless they start to deal with the number of cars on the road, you know, a big more national changes, but that little local authority, you know, it's difficult when they're failing on. So this is one of the problems with air pollution is it's in units that we're not used to very often. And for you, if I said to you, well, outside there's 150 micrograms per metre cubed of NOx, would you go outside? Yeah? Difficult. We're not used to those sort of things, are we, looking at that sort of pollutant? So one of the things you need to do to get an idea of what is high, what is low, what sort of ambient levels there are, this is what this table's for, right, to get you sort of feeling, well, what's a reasonable level. There's no clean air anywhere, so don't think that at all, right? No clean air. There's always pollutants in the atmosphere, because things like ozone are produced naturally anyway, so you can't have clean air. So I'll get that out of the way. So for NOx, beside busy roads, it exceeds 40 micrograms per metre cubed, and if you look at the objectives, it's around about 30, 40, depending on what country you're looking at. So if I said to you there's 150 out there, you probably don't want to go outside. Okay? Peak concentrations very often exceed 100. Yeah? Main rush hour, it's not so bad on Oxford Road now, they've got all the cars though, but Oxford Road in London, it can often exceed 300 micrograms per metre cubed. If you go back to the health objective, you're down at 40. So you're talking about these peak levels as well, real concern. Particulate matter, usually in the range 10 to 30 micrograms per metre cubed, PM10s 10 to 20. So when you start reading papers around this, you might want to think, well, is that high level? Or are you reading the papers? I see a lot now, they're starting to use some of this, these numbers in the paper. Think about how it matches onto the objectives I've been telling you about. Ozone, around about 30 to 80. If you get up to 100, 150, 200 micrograms per metre cube of ozone, you don't want to go outside, especially if you have asthma and breathing problems. NOx is a bit weird because actually, as I said, some of these pollutants are produced naturally anyway because of the atmospheric composition. And in cities, very often NOx, nitrogen oxide pollutants, are lower than they are in rural areas, which is weird, isn't it? Because you think, well, all the roads are in the city. But what happens that these NOx reacts with ozone and reduces some of these levels of NOx anyway. So sometimes you might get lower levels in the city than you do in the rural areas. But don't worry, we can explain that away. So there's tables and tables of these national air quality objectives, all right? Again, remember I said I'm pointing you in directions of things? This is one bit of this big table, which is for protection of vegetation and ecosystems. Okay? So there's tables for health and all different things. This one is for vegetation and ecosystems. And here we've got pollutant nitrogen oxides, objective 30 micrograms per metre cube. So hopefully now you'll realise that that's what they're aiming for. And that's where we are at the moment. Not annual mean, not peak. Remember, these are the objectives, EU directives, what we should be meeting. EU obligations the same. Date to be achieved, 2001. Well, you can forget that. Yeah, we've still got loads areas of the UK much higher than that. And that's why the UK government has been taken to court, because we're not meeting our European objectives for NOx. I'm not going to talk about sulfur dioxide. Again, you can keep going, but that is a phytotoxic pollutant. And then we've got ozone. And I'm going to come back to ozone. I'm not going to do too much now because I'm going to give a whole lecture on ozone. Because ozone has these weird units called AOT40, which is an accumulated dose. So because ozone is one that's very much that it causes injury by accumulating over time. So we're going to come back to that. But these are the target values. So for this, you might remember 18,000. That's probably something just to remember. And when we do ozone later, it might start clicking into place. We also in the UK have air pollution alerts. I don't know whether you know this. It'll come out on the radio. It'll be in the papers. And in fact, I've noticed some papers, you know, where the back page where they have the weather and the weather maps, they've started showing air pollutant levels. Anybody else seen this? I can't remember which paper it was the other day. And I thought, oh, look, it's giving ppm of NOx and everything. Anyway, but in EU, if they measure 180 micrograms per metre cube over an hour of ozone, an alert will go out over the radio and the TV, telling everyone to stay inside, especially if you've got respiratory problems. And it'll be in the papers and everything, and it'll be on the news. This very high level here, this will be information. So this will say, this is to let you know if you've got respiratory problems or anything like that, the levels are quite high. If it hits 240, an alert will come out. And at one time, I did know there was a big siren that went off in the Thames. I don't know whether they still do that now, but they had plans to have a siren that would go off and tell people to get off the streets. I don't know whether they're still doing that. And then they've got alerts for these. So these, if the government, if they measure these levels, they have to put out an alert. And then in 2017, there was 12 alerts for ozone. Yeah? So to have an alert, the levels have got to be really high. You might have noticed, Mayor of London, high air pollution alert triggered. And again, I don't think people realise, they just think, oh, well, it's just high. But there's actually, it means it was very high. For them to say there was an alert, it has a particular connotation for us. It has to be over 240 micrograms, and then the mayor has to go out and tell everybody there's an alert on that time. There's interactive maps where you can go. I'm not going to do it now because I'm going to run out of time, but have a click on these maps and have a look at the maps, and it will tell you what the pollutant levels in different areas for today. Well, maybe it'll come up quick. How much time have I got? Interactive monitoring networks. So these are all the areas. These are all the monitorers. So we're here, Manchester, here we are. I think there's one in Piccadilly. There's the Manchester Piccadilly one. You can go on, look at what the concentration is. I mean, at the moment it's going to be quite low. It's cold. There's not a lot of cars out. But during the summer, you can go to weekly graphs, what the last hour data was. You're logging in directly to that monitoring system in Piccadilly, which is quite amazing, really, when you think about it. Yeah? So if you're asthmatic or you've got problems, especially in the summer when it's a really hot summer day, you can go along and see whether you want to go shopping in Piccadilly. I mean, I'm saying it lightly, but, that could be that problem. If you have go along and have a look and see what the levels are like before, especially if you start going running and jogging, something like that. We've got there's some amazing, resources that we can tap straight into. Obviously, talking to the man on the street, 240 micrograms per metre cube and 30 micrograms, it's a bit much. So what they've done is they've now got what they call banding. So these are all the micrograms per metre cubed of these different pollutants. And rather than telling people what the actual concentration is, they'll say, oh, we're at moderate band 4. Because people can understand that. Do you know what I mean? It's a yellow alert. But it has, if you see that in the newspapers or on the telly, it is very, very particular at what level that band is. It's not someone decided, oh, we'll make it yellow today. Yeah? It's all very, very organised. And if you want to go for today, you can go to today's banding. Here's the banding. So you're all right today. All the banding is green. We're at low for all these pollutants. And this one doesn't tell you which pollutant. This is all the pollutants. So it just shows the highest one. But you can see for today, we're all green. So it's all in the 1, 2 and 3 band. Yeah, so if we go back to this one, it's all down here, low. Yeah, none of them are higher than this level. Okay? So you've got banded health messages. And this was that map. When I went onto that link in August last year, this is the map that came up. And you might not remember it, but this is when there was big alerts going on. And you can see down in southeast England, we were up in the very high levels. And I'm not going to read this out, but it just tells you that if you're at very high, children with lung problems, heart problems, at-risk people, they suggest you don't go outside. So here we're at high, 7 to 9. Don't go out. Anyone sore eyes, consider reducing activity. Yeah. So you can see the link from concentrations up to activity. And then this one, I always keep this one in, even though I update everything else. It's 2015, and it reached 8 or 9 on that scale. You probably don't even remember this event, anybody? It was PM10s were the problem and 2.5s, and it was Sahara dust coming over the UK. And this was on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and you could actually look at that forecasting web and follow as the Sahara dust came over the UK. And there was lots of alerts. It was all in the newspaper. It said, Sahara dust causing air pollutant alerts. And you can see up here we're in the 8 or 9. So this is where, people were really, it was hospitalised. People were getting hospitalised that time because the levels were so high. So, where's it all coming from? So that's the term emissions. All right? So one of this one, I'm going to introduce you to lots of terms. So emissions is one term. Where's it coming from? What's producing it? All right? You can go on to an interactive map, like another one, for emissions. So you can go on to, I'm not going to do this map because I'm going to run out of time, but have a fun of this one, and you can zoom on in to a particular area and see where emissions are coming from. There might be a factory down the road. There might be a shopping centre. There might be a big major road. You can go onto this interactive map, put in your postcode or whatever, and have a look where the emissions are coming from in your particular area. Yeah? And as I said, if you do look at emissions, it's not concentrations now, this is emissions, all right, where it's coming out. You can see for lots of these major pollutants, the emissions have come a lot really reduced since 1970. Look at sulfur dioxide. That was an easy one to fix. You just put scrubbers in your power stations. But there's others like nitrogen dioxide. This is your ammonia, mainly from agriculture, still high. And the problem is they're now seeing this levelling off, and that's the big worry. We've made major strides, but are we seeing a levelling off of decreases in all these pollutants? I've put this data in, so you can have a look at it. You don't need me to talk you through it. But this is the trends in emissions from 1990 to 2017. So again, you can have a look. This is in the EU. The other one was UK, where the major pollutants are and what the trends are in them. And you can see over EU, it's very, very similar to what we have in the UK. Okay. And road transport is the biggest polluter. So key messages for health. Nearly all the urban population over the EU was exposed to ambient concentrations of pollutants above the World Health Organization, the EU limit or the target limit for values of protection of human health. Yeah. And in the EU, premature deaths have been attributed, thousands and thousands of them, to the EU. Right? So that's sort of hopefully put things in perspective for you. As I said, you can go along and look at this interactive map that tells you where a lot of the concentrations of these pollutants are accumulating. You can go and look in particular areas. Right? So impacts. Yeah, this is like a summary slide of all the things I've been blurbing on about. Contributes greatly to poor air quality from roads. Fine particulates and NOx are the main ones. Yeah. And NOx is also a problem because not only is it a primary pollutant, it's one of the ones that drives the formation of ozone, which is a secondary pollutant as well. So to control ozone, you have to control your NOx pollutants. Okay? So those are key things to remember. Now, the problem is, I've been talking about emissions, concentrations. So that's looking at what's in the atmosphere. So if I was an atmospheric chemist, I would be happy. But I'm not, I'm a biologist. Well, I want to know what impact is that all that having. Well, I've just mentioned health. But, you know, all that ozone, all that NOx, what impact is it having? How do I look at that and say, is 40 micrograms per metre cube, is it affecting ecosystems? Is it affecting my crops? Is it affecting my plants? And one of the things now that people are, and scientists and also governments are now working towards, and not necessarily just concentrating on ambient concentrations, but looking at things called critical levels, critical loads and exceedances. All right, so I'm going to explain those terms because this is called effects-orientated pollution control. In other words, so I don't care what concentration it is. What I want to know is it having an impact? Whether it's 10, 20, 30, it doesn't matter. It's what impact it's having. Okay? If I'm talking, and I do know I talk quickly, but I've given you clicks to websites that explain everything that I'm talking about. Much written down for you. So if you're not following what I'm saying, please go and look all these, especially this one here, this APIS. It explains everything about critical loads and critical levels for you. So there's two terms. There's critical levels, all right? So these are the concentrations of the pollutant above which adverse effects on human beings, plants, ecosystem materials may occur. So this is called effects-based pollution control. Don't really matter what the concentration is, but what impact's it having. And then what you need to work out is, well, where in your country is it above that? So the exceedance is it. Again, you don't really matter what concentration, but is it above that critical level? If it is, you can assume that there's a risk of injury in that area. All right? So it might be different. Your critical level in one area might be different to a critical level in the other because it might have an impact on the mountains but not on the chalk downlands. So you can start being much more directed in your pollution control because you're not focused just on concentrations. And there's concentration critical levels have been set for these four pollutants. And now the government is reporting on critical levels as well. So critical levels now for NOx, surprisingly enough, is 30. So that's a critical level. So above that, that's why that's an objective, because they're saying now above 30, there's impacts going on. And so these are all the critical levels for the different pollutants. For ozone, the critical levels depends, obviously, on what habitat you're talking about. Because some habitats can cope with more pollutant than the other. And I'm going to come back to this idea. Okay? So you can almost see for here, like crops, the critical level is 3,000, but for forests, the level is 10,000. Because crops are more sensitive to ozone than most trees. Yeah? So now you're looking at being much more subtle in your pollutant levels. Because you're saying it doesn't matter if it's all 100, one area is going to be more impacted than the other. Critical load, but in contrast, is the quantitative estimate of exposure to one or more pollutants below which significant harm does not occur. Now, the difference between critical load and critical level, which is here, the critical load is the amount of the pollutant that falls onto the ground, yeah? Onto the plants, onto the trees. It's called deposition. How much is coming out of the atmosphere and falling onto your receptor, either in your lungs or on your plant. So again, it's saying it doesn't really matter what the concentration is in the atmosphere, it's how much is actually going down on here, not sitting up in the air, right? Because that's where it's going to have an impact. So this critical load, quantity of pollutant deposited from the air to the ground, whereas critical level is the concentration in the air. All right? Again, if I'm losing you here, go to these links. It talks you exactly through what I'm saying. So the light objectives, like we were talking before, there's actually tables that, given the habitat, it will tell you what the critical load is for that particular habitat. This is one of the research areas I used to work on, beech trees, and working out the critical loads for beech trees. And then we fed into these tables and saying above this level, beech trees are going to suffer growth impacts. This values is 10 pages long for all the different habitats. You can go and have a look at it here, this document, if you want. Because bogs are different sensitivities to woodlands, etc., etc. And it gives you the critical load. So this is how much, for example, nitrogen, this is for nitrogen, kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year that particular habitat can cope with. And above that level, it's showing, you could possibly show injury. All right? So some of them can cope up to 10 kilograms a year, some of them 30 kilograms a year. Notice we're talking about kilograms now. Nitrogen, kilograms of nitrogen. Yeah? We'll come back to this next lecture. We know where all the woodlands are, we know where all the bogs are in the UK, so we can now map where in the country are getting higher levels of nitrogen than their critical loads. You still with me? We're doing quite a journey here. So depending on the habitat, you can have a look and see whether areas which are less sensitive, so here these blue can only cope with 15 and the green 12, so they're coping they're having a critical load there, and then this one, more sensitive, acid grasslands, they're very sensitive to increases in nitrogen. They don't like nitrogen at all, they're things like acid grasslands, and their critical loads are down at 10. So you can do the habitat critical loads. Well, I'm going to go quick next, I'm running out of time, right? You know, you can work out the exceedance because we've got all those maps of air quality, you know, what concentrations. You can work out how much deposited. So you can work out where in the country higher levels of going above the critical load, right? You know what the habitat is, you know what the critical load is. Taking one from the other, right, you can work out what parts of the country are potentially in an environment where injury is taking place because the deposition is higher than their critical load. You still with me? You end up, I'm not going to do this, you end up with a map like this. This is the exceedance map. So these are the areas where it's higher than the critical load for that particular vegetation. So we've gone from concentrations in the atmosphere to actually getting a map that tells you where there's a potential for high injury. So you can see these red areas, exceedances, this is where they're above their critical loads. This is kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. And you can see very easily there's large parts of the UK where the 80% of their area is exceeding their nutrient nitrogen critical load. It doesn't matter what the air concentration is. The amount that's falling on those habitats is higher than what that habitat can cope with. So very often when I'm doing this because when we start looking at research papers on impacts of pollutants, they're starting to use quoting critical loads rather than air concentrations. Because air concentrations don't tell you anything. Yeah? We want to know where it's higher than what that particular thing can cope with. And this graph here shows the percentage area of nitrogen-sensitive habitats. So that's like the Peak District, bogs, acid grasslands. There's about 6 habitats that are really sensitive to nitrogen. And you can see they're up about 70%. This is going back to 1995, and it hasn't changed very much. So around about 70% of these nitrogen, 70 to 80%, are actually having the exceedances of their critical loads. So nearly all the habitats that are very sensitive to nitrogen in the UK are getting more nitrogen than they can cope with. Yeah? So that's quite a sobering thought. And so these exceedances are going to obviously have an impact. This is my last slide. Because they're above the critical load. They're above that threshold. We're talking about kilograms of nitrogen. We're talking about fertilizer levels. And in my next lecture, next 2 lectures, I'm going to talk about what the impacts of these exceedances are. Okay? So, I'm going to finish there. Again, I know I've gone through quite a lot, and if it's all brand new to you, go back and look at those links, those papers, those websites. I've put them all on Blackboard for you as well to go and have a look. Just think of this lecture as a big pair of hands going, look, 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 look. Yeah? Don't forget to read these 2 papers, and when you're reading them, look at the questions, because the questions are really there to say, look at this bit, look at this bit, look at this bit. And they'll talk things about, they'll mention values for critical loads, and hopefully that'll help you realise why they're important. Okay? So I'll see you next week.
Yes, pollutant.
How do you define it?
I know I have no problem, and I can find this, the pollution in my country.
Yeah.
How do you define like a heart attack? How do you know it's triggered by pollutant?
That's a really good question, and I don't know the answer to it. They've done it mainly because I'm not a health